Hi, folks. Still here at the Louvre, checking out the Mona Lisa. We are going to finish up lesson 15, or not finish up, but start lesson 15, and conclude our module 6 PowerPoints. Let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. Alrighty. So, a bit of a switch from our last lesson, which was concluding the mediums unit with architecture. We are now moving into our art history unit, which is our last of like our three big units that we have in this course. The first one was our art theory, our art principles, and elements of design, understanding evaluating artwork. We then moved into our mediums unit, which was modules 4 through half of 6 with drawing, painting, printmaking, all of that. And now we are at our last one, which is the art history section. So um, with the art history section, we're going to start pretty much from the earliest artwork ever made back in the Paleolithic period, all the way up until present day, essentially. So Lesson 15 is covering our prehistoric art that is going to exist from Paleolithic, Neolithic, and Bronze Age periods. And just a little disclaimer at the beginning here, this period of art is a lot different than some of the other artwork that we'll look at in this course because it is just more about this switch in human development from being non-creative minded to creative minded or imaginative minded. So let's look at some of that early artwork and see what it's all about. Um, Another disclaimer, art history, this differs from other kinds of history because we have the works from the past existing still in the present. A one-to-one communication is able to occur from, all of these thousands of years ago in the present day. And it gives us a glimpse into the lives of preceding humans. It's also very beneficial in comparing societies, regions, and human development as well. So let's look at that and see what that all sort of means. So starting at like the very, very beginning of our human development, we start to see, or our artistic human development, we find in the Paleolithic period. And this artwork was made roughly 2 million years ago in East Central Africa. And when I say artwork, it's not as even developed as like the cave paintings that we see here. It's really just sort of like learning to refine tools. There's like an awareness at this point of form and function. Like, in order to carve something pointy, that is a formal choice to make that item more functional, which a lot of the times that has to do with art as well. So, this shows our imaginative advantage over other species. And our first examples that we see all these millions of years ago, thousands of years ago, we see these baseball-sized spheres that were maybe created for a tool or trying to create this idea of symmetry. We don't really know exactly. We don't have language or writing from that point in history to really understand it. And so we just know that there was some attempt to, make something formally look a certain way for a particular function. We also see sprinkled powders and beads, maybe used for, very early paintings or drawings, that sort of themes. And these accompanied burial sites as well. And these can be categorized as like earthen pigments, if you will. Our next kind of jump that we see here in the upper Paleolithic period, because these periods of history, they last, thousands of years. It's not just like a few years. And the upper Paleolithic period, this is known as what is the stone period of found stone figures. Um, we see a lot of these, and our most popular one, our most well-known one, is probably the Venus of Willendorf. There's a lot of suspected uses for this specific figurine. Most likely, she was used as a symbol, as a fertility figurine, for religious purposes. And these little statues here, little figures, they're only a few inches tall, like literally this big is about how big she is. And they are that small because they were typically used as like charms or necklaces, something that could be carried around easily. Because just note for your just regular history portion, during the Paleolithic period, humans are not really moving or migrating long, or they're not really staying in one place for very long. They're more so migrating and moving around. And so, you don't want to have huge sculptures that you're lugging on your back, taking with you. You want to have something small and portable. With these figurines, there was over 200 of these found all over the world. They're really interesting. They're very mysterious because we don't really know exactly where they originated from, but we do know that they are found in all of these places around the world. The Venus of Willendorf is interesting to art historians because of her exaggerated proportions. As you can see here, her reproductive organs are very much engorged in a way that, is not natural. And then her little tiny arms and little tiny feet are just so out of proportion to the rest of her body. So we believe that these exaggerated proportions are directly linked to the spirituality or the religion, and just to symbolize fertility, more or less. At this point in time, food is scarce and hard to come by, and so if have this type of figure that can support, children, and it lets you know that you can, eat well. That's something that's very sought after at this point in time. So this was, probably a very idyllic, set of proportions. So with painting, we also see some early cave paintings. The image that I have here comes from the Chauvet Cave in France. And it is not the oldest cave paintings, but it's probably the most well-preserved set of cave paintings that exists today. Um, these are wall paintings of animals, and we don't really see humans depicted. They are painted with charcoal and earthen pigments. And the Chauvet Cave, sorry, that keeps coming up. The Chauvet Cave, it was so well preserved because it had been covered by this huge stone for thousands of years. And so the moisture in the air, all of that was able to be preserved in a very, like, ideal way. And so up until the 1980s, when it was discovered, it really hadn't been opened for all these thousands of years. And once it was open, people were allowed to go in it and visit and everything, but people quickly realized that it started to deteriorate the walls. And so now it is closed off again, and only like preservation, artists and historians are able to enter it to, work on the preservation. In the Neolithic period, so we're moving forward from Paleolithic, the earliest, to Neolithic, which is in this, set of lessons is the middle, is there's a huge shift from the Paleolithic period. We start to see an agricultural revolution, which required the storage in form of clay pots. So we start to see these vessels come up more commonly. We also start to see bigger sculpture because people did not need to carry them with them as they moved, like in the Paleolithic period, where there's a lot of movement. Neolithic, we start to settle down in smaller areas, more sort of smaller communities start to form. And we also start to see these geometric abstract designs that are really beautiful being painted on the pots. So this really, the artwork that was being made, it really reflects the living patterns as well and gives us a better idea into, what state or what, point in our history we were at this time. Helps us understand the societal point of views. So really beneficial to see these clay pots, to see, this larger sculpture coming from this time because it supports other ideas with this point in history as well. Another thing that we see come from the Neolithic period is plastered skulls, which this is sort of morbid, so I do apologize for that if you're a little bit squeamish, but this is our first real evidence of religious practice beyond just the fertility figurines. So people were typically buried under the floors of their homes. That's how they dealt with their dead. And in some cases, their skulls were removed and covered with a plaster in order to create a very lifelike face, um, complete with shell inserts for eyes, and they would paint them to imitate hair or mustaches. These are the remains of ones that still exist today. And initially, these were only thought to be like the male head of the household. But as we kind of, find more research, we know that these are of women and children as well. So these are, it is evidence of religious practice, but there are some that believe or theorize that these are not so much for religious objects, but rather powerful images made to aid in mourning lost loved ones. Neolithic peoples didn't have written language, so we may never know. But this was a very direct, example of how, we start to think about religion and spirituality and just life beyond, our time on Earth, essentially. And then lastly, in the Neolithic period, we see Neolithic architecture that starts to have more permanence to it rather than in the Paleolithic period where we're pretty much still living like, in caves and in structures that already exist. But this architecture that we see, the biggest example is Stonehenge, which I'm sure, you've all heard of at some point in time. It's still mostly primitive, but Stonehenge is pretty sophisticated for the time period. We start to see, if we remember back in our architectural lesson, the post and beam methods that we kind of can see down there a little bit. And this also replacement of wooden structures with stone structures. So earlier on in the Neolithic period and later in the Paleolithic period, we do start to see or have, evidence that there was some wooden sculpture or structures, but not so much stone that had a much more permanent state to it. The site for Stonehenge, it's debated in what the function was. It most likely was a site for funerary rites. That's the most current theory. But it may have had various functions, maybe like a community center or just a gathering spot of some sorts. They could have been much larger than this, and this might just be the remains. We don't fully understand it, but it is extremely sophisticated for the time period to see this stone moved in the way that it was and how large it is. Now, moving on to our last big period, we're going to talk about the Bronze Age and more specifically Mesopotamia, which if we look at this map here, all of this area there is Mesopotamia to the right, sorry, to the right of Egypt. So this whole kind of, in the Mediterranean Sea area, that all is what is Mesopotamia. So this is what is also known as civilization. All of Mesopotamia, this whole map here. And civilization is a term distinguishing cultures that have complex social orders and high degrees of technical development. Some elements, and it might be, these are in your skeletal notes if you're using skeletal notes, but it might be important to write these down. Some elements that define Mesopotamia, civilization, Bronze Age are agriculture and animal husbandry. So raising and, dealing with agriculture, or sorry, animals for food, clothing, all of the above. Planting crops, really understanding that, we kind of live on this cycle of seasons and we have to prepare for those seasons in order to survive comfortably. We also see occupational specialization. So people, instead of having to do everything, having to, hunt, gather, cook, take care of children, all of that was now being, specialized into these different jobs. And so that made it a lot easier for people to get, better at these things and have better results essentially for the things that they were needing. We also see writing. We start to see our first like signs of language and, documentation of that language. And then obviously, because it is the Bronze Age, we see the production of bronze, which is very, very important in sculpture, as well as, tools and weapons and things like that. Now, if you'd like to pause this Edpuzzle, there is a video about this one kind of civilization within Mesopotamia called Sumer. You can see it right here, kind of at like the southern part of Mesopotamia. And Sumer is the earliest known civilization in the historical region of southern Mesopotamia. It is called the Sacred Mountain, linking heaven and earth because it's so tall. And Sumer was built from these sun-baked bricks, forming platforms on a solid base with a shrine on top. And very little Mesopotamian architecture remains, but this is one that was built into, standards that it is still around. But again, would either come back to this video if you'd like to, but this will be in our Edpuzzle folder as well for you to watch. Now, on the other side of our map that is back over here, we see Egypt. And there's this little kind of like bridge that appears there, which you wouldn't think would be that, uh, that much of a cutoff from it, but it really did sort of separate Egypt from the rest of Mesopotamia for several thousand years, 2,500 years to be specific. So because they were sort of, off to the side from Mesopotamia, there was little outside influence, and Egypt was able to develop their own distinct styles during the Bronze Age, including their architecture, painting, and sculpture. And so the pyramids, the Sphinx here, the just the way of life essentially was so different than other places during this time period because they were able to develop it in their own way. Obviously, for architecture, the Great Pyramids, they were built as a burial vaults for the pharaohs or the god kings, as they were more so known. They really, again, we've kind of talked about this a little bit already, but there was such a value placed on religion and the afterlife in these early traditional arts. So much so that, their largest, most complex, most expensive sculpture and architecture and painting was dedicated to not the living, but to the dead. These pyramids were used as, these long, complicated tombs of sorts to, bury their god kings, and decorate them and honor them essentially. So the pyramids are made from these huge stone blocks, stacked without mortar or without, some sort of adhesive. It's dry masonry. And we see interiors with these narrow passageways that just seem to go on forever. I'm sure at some point you've seen a video game or a movie or something that depicts the insides of the pyramids, but they are very complicated. And on the walls, oftentimes we see a lot of wall paintings that depict the lives of the god kings. This is a wall painting from the tomb of Nebamun. And I wanted to include this one because it is an example of hierarchical scale. Sometimes we have a hard time understanding the difference between proportion and scale. And this is a great example to show how scale and proportion are different. So everything is in proportion with these figures here, but to indicate the importance of the people in them, they are either larger or smaller compared to them. So, i.e., comparing one thing to another rather than comparing one thing to a whole. So this might be the pharaoh or the god king. This might be like, a wife or, some other kind of important figure in their life. And then this last figure down here underneath is maybe like the lowest on the importance. So again, this is an example of scale when it's one thing compared to another thing. But if we go all the way back to our Venus of Willendorf, this is an example of, well, I guess it is proportion and scale, but proportionally, she is very out of proportion. Her midsection, and her breast and her thigh area is so much more enlarged than like her little tiny feet that have made to be so small and her little tiny arms that are, also so small. That is a proportional relationship. But there is also scale as well because she's, this big, but you might not know that unless you were, I mean, when you look at this picture specifically, she could be any size, right? So you don't know what the scale is because she's not compared to anything else. But if she were next to a person, a life-size person, that would be a scale relationship. So hopefully that kind of clarifies that, but that's why I wanted to include two images that dealt with scale and proportion in this PowerPoint because I know that's kind of complicated sometimes. But yes, this concludes module 6. And then next time we will get into our ancient arts of Asia and Africa, as well as traditional European arts as well. So make sure that you watch all the videos in the Edpuzzle folder, and I will see you next time.